Hello, and welcome to my feedback back to you on your Google Hangout 1. And I just wanted to say to your group, Melody, John, and Helen, that I really enjoyed the organization of your Hangout, the way you covered the topics, and the facilitator role in moving the conversation forward. So it was a very successful one for you. You lost one member in a group assignment, so your group is a little bit smaller, but you had a really good breadth and depth of the discussion. So I'm just going to highlight some important points that you've made in your conversations and elaborate on key issues that you raised. When you discussed your the issue of secrecy and domestic intelligence versus foreign intelligence, or historically what we are used to, you made some references about how we are okay and we are very accepting of foreign intelligence collection, gathering on somebody overseas. We're not quite as tolerant as a society to gather intelligence on citizens. So, the discussion evolved there into all those issues that come with different laws that we have, laws of privacy and, of people and their assets and homes and information. And how that comes into play when you are talking about secrecy and lack of transparency, or the need for secrecy. And so John was talking about the issue of intelligence being so much unlike anything that we have encountered that has to do with criminal investigations, where wiretapping and all that, you get a warrant and if there is a probable cause and you conduct those with intelligence, is a little bit more hairy because you actually have to do that before you have a probable cause. So, all this issue comes into play, and you discussed a little bit the role of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court and what role that court has, and under some circumstances, issuing those national security letters, which are kind of like a prelude to the warrant. They were working off incomplete picture and no probable cause. So something to really think about when you talk about the FISA court is that the court was established in the 70s, but it's not until post 9/11 that you look, if you look at the history of FISA court on how many investigations have been approved and how many security letters, national security letters, have been approved. So we clearly see the securitization, and definitely we see a huge role and huge influence of that FISA court, which is outside of our regular judiciary process, somewhat on the fringe for, as far as a threshold of what you need to start an investigation. So that's an issue that you touched on, and I was really glad that you brought it up. Melody talked a little bit about the domestic intelligence and what Dahl talked about, not as much of big data gathering as much as how we are able to analyze. And I think that you talked about connecting the dots. We are going to talk about that more in depth. When you look at the intelligence cycle, or what leads to producing an intelligence product, from the moment you have a policy request to the moment you ask for feedback, so the whole spectrum. Somewhere there in the middle of it, the critical part is the analysis and the ability to make use of everything that you have gathered. After it goes through preliminary exploitation and sorting and processing and stuff like that. So this is sort of a discussion for follow-up sessions, but I'm glad that you talked about analysis, because analysis is, we have, unlike in the Cold War, where gathering was really limited, it's the gathering that was the issue. You did not have access to those things. They were guarded by, Russia and their libraries and their reports, and, it was pretty much unleakable at the time. Whereas now there is so much access through different collection disciplines, and you're gonna learn about those as well. But even with human intelligence, we have so much more access to stuff. Maybe not so much on the domestic front, maybe not, maybe more with signals intelligence on the domestic front. But still, it's the ability to analyze it, to separate what is a noise and what is the relevant, focused, targeted information that you're going to need. And that's a very relevant question to be assessing. Helen had a really good discussion on the private sector in the role of the private business in abridging civil liberties or privacy of citizens without citizens truly minding. We have gotten quite used to, and that's a great point, and that's why it's so wonderful that you have a group of that has a professional in it. That we have gotten used to being market profiled and our telephones being used for telemarketing, and our tastes for a video or a movie or are getting profiled into consumer profiles, and then we target it with all kinds of information. You can turn on your Facebook, and if you like Twinkies, you're gonna suddenly have pop-ups for Twinkies because they have profiled you for your consumer needs or for consumer taste. So in that respect, we are quite tolerant of those private businesses getting into our sphere of privacy. But we're not so much so when it's a government doing it. And so the question is why? And I think that goes into the fundamental consideration that the federal government is there for the people, and the federal government is there to work for us, the notion that we sometimes question, and our taxes pay for what the federal government does, and maybe not so much the private sector, right? Maybe not. We don't have those expectations for private corporations. We actually expect that private corporations are greedy, profit-oriented, go for the bottom dollar, and so societally, it's the government that's the steward of our safety and security, not the private sector. So perhaps that's why that difference in expectation. And we definitely become very, very alarmed when it's the government that is doing all that profiling and collecting data, and we are worried. And I think part of it is also, grounded in history, because when we look at histories of certain countries that have a very strong internal security apparatus, those are the countries that have tremendous civil liberty abuses. And it goes down to, just to mention that French Revolution. I love the example of French Revolution because the French Revolution really was this really wonderful time for the French to sort of say, well, we don't want the king, we don't want the monarchy is not doing for us, we want the representation of the people and ideals of freedom, all those things that we had in the United States, leading to our Declaration of Independence, so fraternity and freedom and liberty. And thus you had the French Revolution. And during French Revolution, it was when the state terror was born. And, if you look into the French Revolution history, that's where the most people got guillotined to death who were opposed to the revolution, or who were threatening to the revolution, or who were not just aligned with some ideas of the revolution. And the French Directorate of Public Safety issued the laws called the Laws of a Suspect, and infiltrated all the businesses in Paris and other places, taverns and centers of learning, and hospitals and other circles, with people who are supposed to eavesdrop and see what people are saying, because they were so worried that this young, wonderful, revolutionary revolution was being threatened because it wasn't established yet, and it was being threatened by other fractions. So that led to tremendous abuses, and led actually to creating a state of terror in France. And of course, you've got very similar issues with the Russian Revolution that of 1917 and the establishment of NKVW, which was the arm of Lenin, and then Stalin, in eradicating all the dissent inside the country. So anybody that was against communist revolution was obviously the enemy of the state. So historically, and of course the examples can be multiplied to other countries as well. The Iranian during the Shah Pahlavi, before Khomeini revolution, had a Savak, which was the Iranian secret police, and they were pretty much doing the same thing, reporting on people that were not supportive of the government. So I think we are always very cognizant of that historically, that collecting information, and during McCarthy era, which Treverton discusses as well, communists, we were so afraid of communists. Hoover made such a big deal of communism, and we were so afraid that we actually had investigations on American citizens that were not legal. And so do we have the distaste for that? Yes, that's why we did not have that sanctioned formal internal security apparatus, as we discussed in your first discussion board. So I thought that bringing up that issue of why do we throw so many obstacles for the government and not necessarily for private sector is very interesting. We are pretty tolerant on one hand, but then we're less tolerant, or we go into the overdrive and we're suspicious of those governmental forces at play. And that ties in with a comment that John made about him going to China and taking the example of the Chinese, which, Chinese, a communist country, quite communist among the communists, because they even fell out in the 50s. They even fell out with the Soviet Union. That's how much they went to the left with the People's Revolution and the Mao Zedong movement. But John's point was, if you suppress and if you push and if you suppress liberties, people will find other ways. There's going to be that reaction, but that, of course, causes tremendous stress on the society. And so, repressed societies can be resilient over time. So it's very interesting to look at that example of China. Because yes, in China, you cannot use Facebook, and yet somehow, this great Facebook wall gets overcome by many citizens. Well, you cannot do a lot of things. Yeah, I have examples for you from, for example, Poland, when I was growing up, and of course it was communist times. A mild version of communism compared to Russia or Cuba or even or China, but communism and Russian dominance nonetheless. And we were just an example. Any government or public official was not allowed to have any faith affiliation. Religion is a big enemy of propaganda. Religion is a big enemy of uniformity, and religion is very big enemy of dictatorships, and definitely religion is the enemy of Marxism. So, which is more of an economical ideology and not religious ideology. And Marxism was the driving force of communism at that time. So, obviously, city officials, police officers, anybody who was at director management level of nationalized industry, they were not allowed to have beliefs that were religious, and they were not allowed to go to church, and they were not allowed to pray and things like that. So, of course, they were not allowed to do that formally, but people still, in their families and within their households, were finding ways to continue their religion, although, they were not necessarily always conforming to that. And some consequences, of course, were terrible consequences, so they had to come up with very, very creative ways of overcoming that. People had no access to true information from the West during propaganda times in Poland. So they would come up with ways to listen to Voice of America from Washington or Radio Free Europe, which were two major broadcasts at that time that were providing unfiltered, non-communized, propagandized information from the West world. And of course it was jammed and by the Russians mostly. And so, I recall my grandmother who was, opening a door of her apartment, and she would say, they're not jamming in the kitchen today. So, she was finding the ways of, getting the wavelength and being able to somehow capture the information, and, and hundreds of thousands of people did that. So again, there is that type of repression breeds resilience. When you have resilience, then, they're sort of that suppressive system doesn't work. So does making those security procedures more stringent, is that effective? That's a big question. So I'm really glad that John brought up the question of China, because China is re-verifying their processes as well, although it's still a communist country. And a very good point that John has also made, which is, if you repress, things go underground. And when things go underground, then you have much lesser chance for detecting it. So, this goes to all the uprisings and underground, clandestine operations that are, in nationalist movements or in wars. The higher the repression, the stronger the reaction. But then, of course, you don't have a way of monitoring because it's all very, very deep underground. So, again, the question begs itself, the investment in all those different systems, is that truly money well spent? Helen mentioned the issues with intelligence and the necessity to profile. And I think this is, a really big one. And particularly, let's take the religious terrorism. There is a lot of arguments to say that, there are the terrorists, religious terrorists, come from a variety of different countries and backgrounds and stuff like that. But generally, we would all agree that we have to put some kind of unifying thing on them in order to be able to put them in a group. And they are definitely, their ideology draws back to misinterpretation of Quran and stealing of the Muslim religion. So naturally, we are profiling those countries, and profiling, stereotyping is the other name for it, helps us put some categories around something in order to have some unit of analysis. Because if we don't have that, so how do we start, breaking it down? So very relevant issues of, how do those people get, selected for targeted, investigations or targeted observation. And I think this is the danger of that, civil liberties and security as well, is that very, very fine line in, hysteria about a particular group, particular ethnicity, and naturally nothing happened yet. So that's a problem with intelligence as well. I think Helen was the one also that mentioned the ethics of collectors, that, it all goes back to the ethics of gathering intelligence, the whole discussion on profiling and over-profiling and, selecting particular vulnerable groups maybe, and ostracizing them. The problem with that, and that's a very valid point about the ethics, but if you think about the intelligence, there is a big separation between the policymaker that requests, the collector that collects, the analyst that analyzes, and then, so go the process. So truly, that people that collect, that have a particular requirement might not always be able to be ethical, because they might not know necessarily where this piece of intelligence is going to and where it fits. And that happened all the time when I was working with the FBI. Is you would get the case and you would work a particular lead, and you only had that particular lead to cover. You didn't see the whole picture. It came somewhere from the DC's desk, and it was needed in some other case that they were putting up with some other social network analysis case. So my ethics as the and I was in counterintelligence, so my ethics were limited to the small picture that I saw, and my judgments were only to the very small picture that I saw. And that's definitely an issue when you talk about processes that go not only within one agency that's federal from the top to the bottom, but when you are dealing with suddenly having law and state and local doing the bidding for federal agencies that have big national security agendas and where stuff is classified and they don't have a need to know. So they are actually providing or canvassing neighborhoods or getting assets or informants, as you talked about, where they don't always know what is the driving force or requirement for that, because it might be classified. And so that's an issue of that local intelligence processes. And something that I think, sorry, I'm looking at my notes here, that you did not mention is intelligence inherently, and that's spycraft, and that's a question you're talking about, the foreign and domestic, involves cultivating assets and having certain methods. And law enforcement does not cultivate assets. Law enforcement has confidential informers in criminal cases, and those are the people that work with law enforcement generally because they make a plea of some sort, and so the confidential informers are totally different, and their motivations are different than your average citizen who is encouraged to provide information on their surroundings. They are truly not an asset in the sense of when we think about foreign intelligence, right? They don't have some kind of huge ideas that their country is going to be liberated by the United States, and that's why they need to do that. What do we appeal to general public? And the issue also with domestic, local, state level law enforcement in being those ears and eyes in the community, in an intelligence gathering sense, is that they do have that trust that you talked about. They have a trust, they have a knowledge, they have access, and they know that community. And this event is going to happen at that most local level. But then, how this is used later by the federal agencies can tremendously impact the trust on that community in that local law enforcement. So if you have policies, or if you have some investigations and suddenly turn, into being not welcome by the community, like, excessive profiling of Muslim residents, you can lose that fabric of trust with local law enforcement, and that's very dangerous as well. So, do we want them in that role of having their network of confidential informers? And then that comes with, how do we know that there are no other agendas in those neighborhoods? I can certainly say that my neighbor is suddenly storing strange things, and people come in the middle of the night and visit my neighbor just because I don't like my neighbor, right? So all kinds of issues that can be raised with that. What happens when we give full intelligence gathering ability to local law enforcement? It could bite them in return by losing that very, very important relationship with people that they have because of the work that they do. So you had quite a good discussion on the FBI coming to a local area, like in Galveston County, and I think Helen talked about that. They're not going to know the county. They're not going to know the people, and for most part, people are not going to talk to them. It is sort of logical to rely on the local law enforcement. It's really important, though, that there's a clarity what this intelligence is and what it's needed for. And I think that one of the most common complaints about fusion centers, and you're going to talk about fusion centers in subsequent classes, the problem with fusion centers, and everybody complains about it, is that the feds want everything from the local level. They want all the details. They want all the information, and they bring very little. They pipe very little down in return. Once they have their products, when they have their analysis, it very rarely gets back to the local level and gets fed back. So that's always been, the issue, that one-way relationship, only going up towards the Fed and not necessarily coming down. The question about whether the Navy officer, in the same vein, understands the community. You talked about the military relationships with the public, and of course they are governed by certain laws. The military can possibly have some relationships with local law enforcement, but they are not dealing with the public per se, and that's regulated in the United States. So, that's an interesting topic you talked about. When you talked about the MI5 and the totally new agency for domestic intelligence gathering, I think there was a consensus in your group that we need to work with what we've got, and we've created this huge Department of Homeland Security. And should we strengthen certain areas of that? How about the FBI? Yes, they have assumed the role of the domestic intelligence, particularly after the Intelligence Reform Act of 2004. But they are organizationally and culturally a criminal law enforcement mindset. So, is that possible even to achieve a really good intelligence apparatus out of them, or are they always going to be predominantly law enforcement, criminal driven, with small subset of that intelligence type function? And and I think that's a still open question. We've seen a lot of different fluctuations in those agencies. CIA was about to be made redundant in 1991 when the Soviet Union was no longer, because CIA did not predict one of the biggest and major events of the 20th century. The fall of the breakup of the Soviet Union was one of them. So CIA was almost on the block, and so we are seeing how those things evolve. Helen agrees that creating another, I think between John and Helen, you agreed that creating another agency diffuses the focus, that we already have this really vast intelligence community with all those different players there, and we just need to restructure maybe what we've got. And so that's your take on that. Melodie, you really drove down the point that whatever it is for Homeland Security, for domestic intelligence, it needs to be grounded in local community. And then again, that drives us back to how does it look like? Fusion centers, yes, regional task forces, and you had a really good discussion on that. And then, are we truly getting enough out of security? Are we getting money's worth? Is intelligence and the money we spend on it worth it when we look at, the outcome? And so there's very interesting what Helen said about, a refinery versus a society at large, and assessing government institutions versus assessing a corporation. Obviously, there is a sense of, what is a mission of a particular entity. And, for a corporation, the mission is profit. For the government, the mission is making sure that, we live according to the Constitution, and the three branches of the government, are doing their job. So how do we assess if intelligence works? And I think Dal had those reflections on, we only know when it doesn't work, because that's when we have intelligence failure. So this is a sort of reverse way of looking at it. And then, how do you put a value on saving lives? And then how do you measure prevention? How do you measure prevention? It's a little bit of a similar question of how you measure deterrence, but how do you measure prevention when you can't measure what has not happened? And what has not happened might not always be just related to one variable. Somebody in your group, or maybe in a different group, mentioned, just the way you talk to someone could have dissuaded them from doing something. And that officer, might not never know that they have done that. So how do we measure it? And I think this is going to be a path forward with intelligence studies, is going to try to come up with any type of assessments or matrix or impact studies or perception studies. What do we think is the cost-benefit analysis? And I'm not saying necessarily that it has to be monetary, but in some ways assess what we do. And because definitely we're going towards securitization, right? I think John was also talking about the role of mitigation versus, and I think he used resiliency, I think he meant response, the cost of a response versus the cost of mitigation and investing in something. And that's truly a very, very valid discussion. But you can agree or disagree that Boston Marathon and the work of FBI and local agencies was response. That was definitely not, we have not prevented the event from happening. So now we are assessing a response. If you were talking about the intelligence on Boston Marathon bombing, did we truly do that well? Because Tsarnaev was definitely in the scopes both of the Russia national security apparatus, as well as he was interviewed by our federal services. So did we really do that great with Boston Marathon in prevention? So that begs the question of, if we can't prevent, how do we focus on learning to live with it and building resilience and focusing on response? And maybe that is the part that John was trying to tease out. I'm not certain on that. But I recently went last week to the Natural Hazard Workshop in Colorado. It's a national event. And I had a privilege of going to the area where they had huge forest fires in 2012, I believe 2012 or 2013. And those are accelerating, those wild forest fires in Colorado. And we talked to the owner of the home, the only home in the area of a tremendous fire that did not burn. The home was mitigated. So the entire property was mitigated against wild forest fire. So, the owners did really spend a lot of money on cutting out all the trees, that particularly the juniper trees that carry the ambers. They also saved the aspen trees that are a moisture barrier for the fire. So they did a lot of, they got educated on forest fire mitigation, hazard mitigation, and they said, and they invested a lot of money into it over the 3-year period. And they said that they realized when they moved to that area that they cannot fight the fire. They have to learn how to live with it. And you would be amazed just looking at that property where everything was scorched. That 107 feet tall wall of fire pretty much was at their house and sort of stopped at their house. And you see the entire perimeter where they did all the clearings and all the proper management and hazard mitigation, and how they were able to live with it. So it's a digression, but it's sort of my thinking on, do we learn how to live with terrorism and focus on the response and the resilience like the Israeli do? And that's, in one of the discussions, you look at the Israeli model, and, the nation that has lived with terrorism and that sort of expects that they are not able to prevent every event. And so their investment is on educating citizens what to do when it happens. You know, the mass casualty, the dealing with chemical events, the every citizen having a mask, and so that's a totally different approach. And that's not to say that Israel is not securitizing, because they are. So that's in a gist, you know, some of the highlights of your discussion. And I enjoyed the way you presented it, Melodie. Very good job on moderating, and I'm looking forward to your second session.